And so there are three models of decision making. And I want to highlight these. The presidential leadership model is also referred to as the Hamiltonian Model. And so you can kind of remember that Alexander Hamilton is a strong advocate of a strong executive. So he is kind of the face of a strong presidential leadership model. We have what is referred to as the executive party model, which really is more in line with something that Jefferson would be in favor of in terms of using the power of the party to really help make decisions. And then the executive congressional model is really what James Madison, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, envisioned about how the executive and the legislative branch would work together. So let's just first start talking about the Hamiltonian model or the presidential model. And this is a model of making decisions and running the executive office that favors a strong and energetic executive. Think of Abraham Lincoln, and if you watched Lincoln the movie a couple of years ago, you really see him using the power of the presidency to really make decisions. Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, is also a good example. And so the question is, how does he get leadership? And a famous political scientist who wrote a book on the power of the presidency says that presidents acquire leadership through their presidential power, and that is influence. Influence is the power to persuade. And so Neustadt argues that the president derives power not just from the constitutional or institutional sources that we've already discussed, but rather from his ability to persuade and influence. And so the office and duties of the president are inherently designed to make him weak and inefficient. We've seen that. The office and duties of the president are inherently designed to make him weak and inefficient. He has a very large bureaucracy that he has to run that, while gives him a lot of information, makes it very inefficient. He's weak constitutionally. And so the president, according to this model, has to employ his professional reputation, his public prestige, as leverage or bargaining tools in dealing with the demands that are placed upon him. And Neustadt also argues that a president must continually search for information that will provide choices and alternative actions. So the president in the presidential leadership model is always on a quest for information. But ultimately, and this might be the key point, ultimately the president can only rely on himself to provide the necessary information in order to make prudent decisions. And this leads to the presidential leadership model. And this model also suggests that the president needs to protect power from Congress, and it goes back to that fight against Congress for authority over issues. So in this particular model, image is everything. This presidential model is characterized by flexibility, speed, control of information, and assertiveness. So this requires a president to be able to make decisions efficiently, quickly. He has to be flexible. He has to be able to control the flow of information coming and going. And many people argue that this model describes how U.S. presidents acted and ran the presidency up until Watergate. And so even though presidents continue to attempt to employ it, since Watergate, they haven't had as much independence and authority because of the scandal. This is also referred to something or similar to what is considered the stewardship model. Those subscribing to a stewardship theory call for a strong, assertive presidential role or presidential view. That's really prevalent still today. And so the stewardship or this presidential leadership model argues that a strong president is needed to respond to national and foreign crises, that a large and active government is also conducive to a strong presidency. And the president is also, of course, the foreign policy leader for the United States. And so this nation with an important political, military, and economic role in the international arena needs a strong president. If we think about the expansion of the role of the state in areas of economic regulation and social welfare, then the president as chief executive and legislative leader has also necessarily gained power. So there's all these reasons why the presidential leadership model is favored by presidents. It gives them a lot more authority, but they have to have the personality to be able to wield that kind of influence. Of course, there is a critique of this particular model, that there's too much dominance by presidents, and this is what led to Watergate, for example, or the Iran-Contra affair. And that congressional participation is important because of the oversight function. One of the questions that also comes up is, does this model still apply today in the 21st century? Is the model compatible with the Constitution? And obviously it's really not, because this model suggests that the president goes beyond the Constitution to find power, the power of influence. And in today's environment, it's hard to really separate out foreign policy from domestic policy. So let's move to the executive party model, and this is also referred to the Jeffersonian model, if you will. This is characterized by executive teamwork, majority rule, and party responsibility. After all, the president is the party chief and head of a strong party. So people like Woodrow Wilson would like this model, or of course Thomas Jefferson. We don't see this model very often. The problem is that in order to have an executive party model, you have to have strong political parties. And we know that there is weakness in American political parties because we don't have strong parties in the United States. Remember, they're weak and decentralized. And part of that is the electoral process that we've talked about before. This model is also ineffective in American politics because of the perception of parties in America, where there's distrust, but also because of divided government. What we see now, where you have the Senate dominated by Democrats and the Republicans dominated by the Senate's dominated by Democrats, and the House is dominated by Republicans. So the president really can't work well with this executive party model because he has a party from the opposite spectrum that he has to deal with. So then we move to the executive congressional model. This is the Madisonian model, and this is really emphasizing checks and balances. So there's 4 elements to the executive congressional model that if we think about. One of them is checks and balances that I have here. Secondly, this executive congressional model also provides more protection of minority rights because you have the checks and balances, and it goes beyond just the executive and congressional and includes the judicial. Third, it protects against a tyrannical majority. It protects one particular branch for having too much power over the other, and it also provides, fourthly, for limited government. And so the executive congressional model is much more in line with what the Constitution has outlined. And so the advantages, of course, is number 1, it's more constitutional, and number 2, it's conducive to divided government. So we can have progress made even when there's divided government. All right. So those are the models of decision making that I wanted to point out to you. Well, what makes a president successful? What are the factors of presidential success? And so if we look at what presidents are successful and what presidents aren't, and if you recall back to the graphs from Tuesday where we showed how presidential approval tends to decrease over time, there are going to be particular things that makes a president's success. And one is there a crisis. In times of crises, presidents can wield enormous influence, but this will diminish over time. So for example, I showed you the spike in John F. Kennedy's presidency after the Cuban Missile Crisis. We saw a spike in George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency after Desert Storm. And so if there's a crisis, the president tends to have more power and therefore will be more successful. The stage of the presidency is going to matter. Every presidential term can be divided into stages corresponding to the level of authority available to the president, determining his or her ability to influence events. So you start off with the honeymoon phase, And the honeymoon period for most presidents is a time when quick and decisive actions can occur. Conversely, presidents are not as effective later in their terms of office. So the honeymoon phase, you might have heard of the first 100 days. People talk about this in the Kennedy administration, for example. But that first 100 days in office is when the presidency is still experiencing a honeymoon with the public. And so public opinion is high. The president probably was swept into the office with other people of his party during the presidential election. And so he hasn't faced the off-year election when the president's party tends to lose power, lose seats. And so he has this honeymoon phase. So he's going to be more successful in the first several years of his presidency, and then presidential success is going to wane. And we can define presidential success as getting his legislative agenda passed or having a foreign policy success. There comes a time when the president is considered to be a lame duck president, and that is toward the end of their presidency, and that's because Congress is willing to wait until the next election cycle to deal with any particular legislation because the president cannot be reelected. So the lame duck occurs, that period of time occurs in the last year or so of a president's second term. Okay? All right. Is the issue a foreign policy issue or is it a domestic policy issue? Presidents tend to have somewhat more power and influence in foreign affairs. We've seen that. They've expanded their particular influence in foreign relations. They're able to make appointments, they're able to make treaties, they're able to talk diplomacy with other leaders. And during the Cold War, if you remember, we had that thing called the Cold War Consensus that led to a lot of agreement on what to do with foreign policy. There's far less consensus now, and so foreign and domestic policies don't have as much difference in success as they used to. What is the relationship the president has with Congress? Acquiring congressional support is essential for becoming and remaining a successful president. However, not all presidents possess the political skill required to successfully manage relations with Congress. LBJ was very good at this. He was able to deal with Congress very effectively. He had spent just about his whole adult life as a congressperson, and so understood how to deal with the legislative process. Other presidents who haven't been as successful dealt with issues such as divided government, like George Bush, and we're seeing that with Obama right now. And so there's a reason why LBJ was able to get civil rights legislation passed, because he really had the ability to work with Congress. So while presidents can exercise the veto to influence Congress, the overuse of the veto may signal executive weakness or undermine his relationship with Congress. Also, the president must use the power to persuade in a system of divided powers. So he has to figure out how to have good relationships with the two branches in the Congress, the two chambers, even if one of those chambers is dominated by the opposite party. So presidents tend to be more successful if they treat members of Congress as a constituency, that is, responding to their interests and needs. The degree of partisan support for a president within Congress can have an impact on presidential performance as well. So, for example, again, President Johnson was very successful in obtaining congressional approval of his legislative agenda in 1965 when the Democrats had a solid numeric majority in both houses of Congress. So again, the Democrats dominated Congress for a long time after World War II. But of course, there have been periods of collisions between the presidency and Congress, and as we've already discussed, the War Powers Act is the most significant congressional attempt to restrain the power of the presidency. So again, in the war-making area, we can see this strain between the president and Congress. Of course, the level of public support has a major effect on the president's ability to obtain his policy goals. The presidents tend to attribute economic downturns to the presidency, thus lowering overall public confidence in the institution. Remember, we saw that dip in George Herbert Walker Bush's public approval after that big high after Desert Storm. It plummeted because of the economic downturns. And remember, retrospective voting, that the public tends to look back on the economy to judge how they're going to vote in the future. And presidential approval ratings usually decrease over time, as we've already seen. Of course, the personal character of the president has some effect on that, and we saw that with the ability of Ronald Reagan to maintain his level of public support even during issues of things like Iran-Contra. And international crises, when it comes to public opinion, nearly always increases a presidential approval rating in the short term. And again, that's rallying around the flag. However, increase in deaths leads to a decrease in public support. And then, of course, modern presidents must use television. Television creates advantages and disadvantages for the president. A major advantage of the modern president is the ability to access TV, such as going public, as we already said, bypassing Congress and appealing directly to the American people. The presidents must put their spin on the news to counter negative reporting, which is a disadvantage to the president because of modern media. Frequent television appearances and claims of success add to the public belief that the president is in charge of the national government. And this perception is the illusion of presidential government. Okay, so the irony is that the presidential office grows weaker as the number of problems increase. Presidential success rates is in getting their initiatives through Congress has varied considerably, but ultimately the factors in a president's success include the presence or absence of conditions that require strong leadership from the White House. So are there things, are there crises, are there events that are going to occur in foreign or domestic policy that require strong leadership from the White House? Number two, the stage of the president's term. So success comes early. The strength of the president's party in Congress. What is the relationship with Congress? And the focus of the policy issues. Presidents do somewhat better in the area of foreign policy than in domestic policy. So those are the elements that are going to make for a successful presidency. All right. I'm sorry. I should have clicked on that, the relationship with the media. So again, ultimately what determines the level of success for the presidency, if we add up everything else on this slide, the presence or absence of a national crisis. So what are the conditions? So is there a crisis? Is there some sort of foreign or domestic policy that matters? The stage of the term of the presidency. Are they the honeymoon phase or are they lame duck? What is the strength of the president's party in terms of his relationship with Congress, in terms of their ability to deal with foreign or domestic policy? And what are the issues? Is it a foreign policy issue or is it a domestic policy issue? Okay. All right, excuse me. So that's where we'll end this relatively brief lecture on factors of presidential success.